endured the quiet agony of obedience and defeat. When General Douglas MacArthur stepped onto Japanese soil on August 30th, 1945, he carried more than authority. He carried a philosophy. He had fought the Japanese across the Pacific, had witnessed their ferocity and refusal to surrender. Yet he arrived in Tokyo not as a vengeful conqueror, but as a sculptor of peace. MacArthur understood something that many of his subordinates did not. A nation can be broken by force, but only rebuilt by respect. He ordered that the emperor remain as a symbolic figure to preserve social cohesion. He forbade Allied soldiers from assaulting or mocking Japanese citizens. He personally visited bombed-out areas, allowing photographers to capture him standing among civilians, a towering figure, yet calm and composed. His policy toward Japanese officers was equally deliberate. While war crime tribunals would pursue justice against high-ranking figures, the average soldier, officer, and bureaucrat were to be reintegrated, not annihilated. MacArthur's reasoning was pragmatic. Japan would become America's bulwark against future instability in Asia. But his methods were rooted in psychological mastery. He knew that to truly win, America had to win Japan's mind. The simple act of an American bowing before serving food symbolized this broader strategy. It told the defeated, "We do not seek to humiliate you, we seek to transform you." By offering dignity to those who had lost everything, MacArthur ensured that Japan's surrender would not metastasize into resentment, but into cooperation. And it worked. Within months, the same soldiers who once fought for the emperor were clearing rubble, distributing rations, and assisting in rebuilding projects under American supervision. MacArthur had achieved something extraordinary. He had turned submission into partnership. The psychological angle, the silent collapse of pride. For the Japanese officers, however, this transformation was anything but easy. Their world had collapsed not in battle, but in meaning. For generations, the military had been the spine of the nation, the purest expression of loyalty and sacrifice. Now, that spine was broken. Many officers could not reconcile their training with the new reality. They were told to live, but living felt dishonorable. They were told to accept help from the enemy, but help felt like exposure. Psychologists working with occupation forces recorded a pattern of moral paralysis among former officers, an inability to act, think, or feel purpose after defeat. In the camps, the bow from an American soldier was more than politeness, it was confrontation. A mirror held up to everything they had believed. They had been taught that Westerners were weak, decadent, incapable of honor. Yet here stood a young American, offering food with respect, discipline, and calm. The morning began in mist. Gray light spilled across the harbor where wrecked ships leaned half-submerged in the tide. The air smelled of salt and smoke, a mixture of sea and ruin. On the wharf stood rows of makeshift tents, the American relief station for repatriated personnel. Inside, Japanese officers lined up in silence. Hundreds of them, lean, pale, exhausted. Their once gleaming uniforms were faded to the color of ash. Some still wore their caps, others carried them pressed against their chests like sacred objects. The emblems of rank, stars, eagles, and swords had been stripped away. Only their posture remained military, straight-backed, eyes fixed forward, pride bound tightly behind blank faces. Across from them, American servicemen worked briskly at long wooden tables. Steam rose from steel pots. Rice, thin soup, a few pickled vegetables, hardly enough for an army, but to the starving, it was salvation. The Americans had been briefed the night before. A young lieutenant, reading from a cultural handbook, had explained, "Gentlemen, in Japan, the bow is respect. You bow not to mock them, but to show that the war is finished." The soldiers listened in silence. Some scoffed. Others nodded. They had fought these same men in jungles and islands. Now they were asked to serve them with grace. But the order was clear. No insults, no arrogance, no vengeance. At 0900 hours, the first line of Japanese officers approached. A corporal ladled rice into a metal bowl, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and bowed. A small, precise inclination of the head, not exaggerated, not sarcastic, just respectful. The Japanese major standing before him froze. His lips trembled slightly, his eyes glistened. For a man who had once led hundreds into battle, that single gesture cut deeper than defeat itself. He bowed back, a motion born of instinct, not thought. Then, slowly, he accepted the bowl. Around them, the line shifted. More soldiers bowed. More officers returned the gesture. No one spoke. Only the clatter of ladles and the faint hum of wind through the ruined port filled the air. An American sergeant later wrote in his diary, "It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. We bowed to them. They bowed to us, and for a moment it felt like neither side had won anything. We were just men, trying to stay decent in a world that had gone mad." For the Japanese, that meal was more than nourishment. It was confrontation. Each bite carried the taste of surrender, but also of survival. Their pride, once absolute, now trembled beneath the weight of a foreign kindness they could not refuse. The moment of realization. As the day went on, the atmosphere shifted. The first awkward exchanges gave way to rhythm, a quiet choreography of respect. Bow, bow, acceptance, silence. The Americans began to understand the gravity of their actions. The Japanese began to sense something beyond humiliation, something like grace. An elderly colonel, his face lined with exhaustion, whispered to a younger officer beside him, "Even in defeat, they honor us. That is the burden of the strong." It was not an official statement. No journalist recorded it. But such words lived on in memory, repeated later by interpreters, recalled by witnesses. The scene became emblematic of the new order that MacArthur envisioned, an occupation not built on fear, but on controlled dignity. By late afternoon, the mist had lifted. Sunlight spilled through the clouds, glinting off the harbor waters where cranes stood rusted and still. The lines shortened. The last officers received their bowls. Each one bowed. Each one was bowed to. A ritual of reconciliation performed in silence. Nearby, an American chaplain watched quietly. He wrote later in a report to headquarters, "It was the first time I felt that peace had truly begun. Not when the guns fell silent, but when a hungry man was fed with respect." That single day marked something larger than anyone present could fully grasp. It was not recorded in military communiques or front-page news, but it lived on in memory, retold by Japanese civilians who witnessed it, by American relief officers who carried it into old age. In that moment, the line between victor and vanquished blurred. The war had been fought with steel and fire, but it was ended with humility. The bow, once a symbol of submission, became the quiet declaration that the war's spirit was over. As night fell over Yokohama, lanterns flickered across the harbor. The Americans packed their utensils. The Japanese officers dispersed into the shadows of a broken city. No one sang. No one cheered. But something irreversible had shifted. The empire that had demanded obedience through fear was gone. In its place, a new kind of honor was being born, one that began not with a sword, but with a bow. And yet, for many Japanese officers, the meaning of that day would not settle easily. In the silence that followed, they would wrestle with pride, shame, and the question that haunted every survivor. What does it mean to be honorable in defeat? The collapse of the code. In the days after Yokohama, the story spread quietly across Japan. Not through newspapers, those were censored and carefully controlled, but through whispers among returning soldiers, through letters, and through the grapevine of rumor that sustained a starving population. They bowed, some said in disbelief. The Americans bowed to us. To the older generation, the words sounded like mockery. To the younger ones, they carried something different, confusion, even hope. But for the former officers who had lived their entire lives under the Bushido Code, the act cut to the marrow. The Bushido ideal, loyalty, courage, honor unto death, had been the spiritual armor of the Japanese military for centuries. It demanded obedience to the emperor, sacrifice for the nation, and scorn for surrender. Defeat was a shame worse than dying. Mercy was a foreign weakness. And yet, here stood the Americans, merciful, courteous, unshaken. The code that had justified everything, from conquest in China to suicidal charges on Pacific beaches, now stood hollow. The men who had built their lives upon it felt it collapse like a physical wound. Many could not face the contradiction. They had been taught that the Western enemy was morally corrupt, spiritually inferior. But the Americans' restraint defied that image. It was discipline without cruelty, power without arrogance, a strength that the Japanese officer corps could neither dismiss nor equal. A few wrote in their diaries that the humiliation was unbearable not because the enemy had bowed, but because the enemy had become more Japanese than they were. The invaders now embodied the very virtues Japan had claimed as its own: respect, honor, and restraint. The surrender of the spirit. Across Japan, the visible signs of defeat were everywhere: bombed cities, food lines, abandoned weapons. But beneath that devastation, a deeper surrender was unfolding, not of the body, but of the spirit. At former garrisons in Nagoya, Sasebo, and Sendai, small ceremonies of gratitude began to appear. American officers visited hospitals where wounded Japanese soldiers lay recovering. Instead of lectures or commands, they offered food, cigarettes, sometimes even letters of families. A translator would bow as he spoke the word omoyari, compassion, the same word that had been absent from years of war. One officer, a former colonel from the Kwantung Army, later recalled, "It was then I understood that defeat does not destroy dignity. Only arrogance does. The Americans treated us as men, not as enemies. That was harder to endure than punishment." These were not grand statements for the press. They were quiet, handwritten confessions, the kind found in personal memoirs decades later. They revealed a collective reckoning, a recognition that Japan's fall had not come from lack of courage, but from moral blindness. The act of the bow, that moment of mutual recognition, became the psychological pivot. It stripped away the myth of divine purpose and replaced it with something painfully human. It was as if, in that brief exchange, the Japanese officers saw themselves reflected not as warriors, but as men, flawed, hungry, and free to feel shame. And with that realization, the war, the real war, ended. Not the one fought with bullets, but the one fought within the human soul. The weight of silence. The Japanese are a people of silence. In 1945, silence was not avoidance, it was endurance. Men who had seen the Americans bow did not speak of it often. They carried it quietly, as one carries an unhealed wound. In family homes across the country, fathers who had returned from the front refused to discuss the war. Children grew up sensing the weight without words. When asked, some simply said, "It ended differently than we expected." Others avoided eye contact, their hands trembling slightly as they changed the subject. Historians later noted that Japan's post-war humility, its politeness, its obsession with perfection, its reverence for order, was not merely cultural. It was psychological. It was born from this wound, the shock of being treated kindly by one's conquerors. In time, that silence became the foundation of peace. The same officers who had once believed that surrender was dishonor began teaching their children that humility was survival. The bow, once unbearable, became a daily act again, but now emptied of hierarchy, filled instead with mutual respect. The moral order had inverted. Famine loomed. The average daily ration in late 1945 was under 1,500 calories, barely enough to sustain life. Diseases spread in the ruins of bombed-out neighborhoods. Children scavenged in markets. Mothers traded heirlooms for food. The occupation government launched massive relief programs, distributing grain, rebuilding hospitals, reopening schools. American soldiers were instructed to share surplus rations with locals, a policy that turned many enemies into reluctant allies. In villages, farmers began to see GIs not as conquerors, but as providers. Bread and canned milk, foreign luxuries once symbols of Western decadence, became lifelines. But the psychological wounds ran deeper. Former officers, stripped of purpose, wandered through the ruins like ghosts. Suicide rates among veterans rose sharply in 1946 and 1947. Letters recovered from their families tell of unbearable shame, not for losing the war, but for surviving it. One former lieutenant wrote, "The Americans are kind, too kind. It is this kindness that kills us slowly." It was the same paradox that had begun at Yokohama: kindness as humiliation, compassion as power. And yet, from that paradox, Japan began to rise again. The foundation of renewal. Under MacArthur's guidance, Japan adopted a new constitution in 1947. Article 9 declared that the nation would forever renounce war as a sovereign right. The emperor became a symbol, no longer divine but human, a figure of unity rather than authority. Education shifted from militarism to democracy. A generation of children learned that the sword no longer defined their country, that peace, discipline, and cooperation would. Factories began humming once more, not for battle, but for rebuilding. The same discipline that once forged weapons was now poured into craftsmanship, technology, and precision. The moral energy of Bushido found a new form, not in killing, but in creating. But while Japan's structure was being rebuilt from the ground up, its soul still carried the silence of defeat, a silence that would take decades to heal, and which would find its meaning in the next chapter of Rebirth by Night. History remembers the noise of war, the thunder of artillery, the cries of battle, the roar of aircraft. But its truest lessons are written in silence. In Yokohama, in 1945, silence spoke louder than any victory parade. It was a silence of men who had lost everything, and of those who, in winning, refused to gloat. The Americans bowed. The Japanese officers bowed back. And between those two gestures, separated by pain, joined by respect, the 20th century turned a page. For centuries, nations had measured greatness by conquest. But in that small act, another kind of greatness emerged, one born not of domination, but of restraint. It was power disciplined by empathy. It was the understanding that to rebuild an enemy, one must first recognize their humanity. For Japan, that moment was both wound and salvation. It shattered the illusion of divine destiny, but it preserved something deeper, the capacity for honor without violence, for pride without arrogance. Out of humiliation came humility. Out of humility came peace. The bow, once a symbol of subservience, became the language of equality. The same nation that had once worshipped the sword rebuilt itself upon respect, respect for life, for order, for others. Its soldiers laid down weapons and picked up tools. Its people transformed shame into discipline, defeat into purpose. The Americans left, but the bow remained, in every greeting, every ceremony, every exchange that carried grace in place of aggression. What began as an act of occupation became a covenant of peace. And so, history closed the circle. The empire that had sought to rule Asia through fear found its rebirth through courtesy. The victors, who bowed before the defeated, proved that the highest form of strength is not to conquer, but to understand. In the end, the war's greatest victory was not written in treaties or memorials. It was written in the quiet humility of a single human gesture, one bow, one meal, one moment that redeemed a century of fire.